Hi, everyone. I hope you've all had a great week. My name is Michael Stuvey. I work as a counselor in rural Nebraska, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Oregon State University. This presentation today will focus on AI use within counseling and counselor education. I'm going to start with just a quick introduction to AI, and move on to how it's impacting counseling and counselor education, along with just possible applications that we might be able to use these for. We'll end up talking a little bit about just some ethical issues for the use of this technology. And I do want to note that this is coming from the perspective of a counselor and not a software engineer. So I'll tend to look a little bit more into the practical uses of these services. And while I try and be as knowledgeable as I can here, there are certain parts of the technology that I'm still trying to understand. And so I'm just kind of keeping that in mind as we're going on. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation, and we can go ahead and get started. So I'll go ahead and pull this up. And something that I'm excited about today is I'm going to provide several examples of some of the things that we'll be looking at, because I think it's really important for us to get a good understanding of like what these look like at all these different levels, because it's being implemented in so much of what we do day to day, but then in our careers and online, I think we see a lot of it. And so I think we have a lot of different aspects that we'll touch on and then dive into, hey, this is how practically we can use this and how we can use this well. So let's go ahead and jump into those AI basics. We're going to talk just a little bit about what these look like, what these different kinds of AI look like. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical side of it and what it means for these large language models, or what these LLMs are. So just kind of starting off, this will be really interesting because we have so many different kinds of AI. And this is something that can get really confusing from the outside because there's just so many little subsections. And so I'm going to focus more broadly on how do these function? Like, how do they look to us as we are using them? And so I'll just kind of start this off with saying that not all of these are going to have necessarily an impact on counseling practices or education, but they might be able to be tied in. And there's something that we really need to be aware of because there's so many other aspects outside of our like education or our counseling where this might be causing an impact or impacting our clients. And so for these, I tried to pull the most used versions, or at least the easiest to find versions of these, because those are more likely the ones that you type in AI at some point and then you find these and they get pulled up really quickly. And I've also experimented with almost all of these just to get an idea of what it looks like on the side of using, because I think that can be a big hurdle and something that we're kind of considering when we talk about this. So just starting off with these LLMs, large language models, these are the ones that I think most people are very familiar with. They've seen it in one way or another. They had a really big boom when ChatGPT ended up coming out, and it's just been one that's kind of grown. This is one that you see not only on ChatGPT, but you see built into things on your phone, like the assistant sometimes, especially with the new Apple AI. And you'll also see it when it comes to on most phones, you may have like an AI button now or something that can search it. So this is almost all through text. It's something where you can ask a question or ask it to do something and it'll provide a text response. So there's ChatGPT, there's Claude, which is a AI that's more oriented towards education and research. So that one's a little bit different there. And that's what I'll be showing some examples of later. And then there's something called character AI, which is very different than the other ones because it's less about, hey, we want to create these answers to these questions. And it's more like we want to have a conversation with this AI version of a celebrity. And so you make this personality for this. And this is something that teens do, or teens jump into quite a lot. And this is just, hey, I want to talk to this character in a form of role play. And so while it's being used in that form right now, I think we'll end up, and I'll talk of the implications and ramifications of this later, that is something that we could pivot into counseling in one way or another. And we'll see a few examples of how it's already being used in counseling. And so let's kind of jump over to audio. And so these audio ones create what we would kind of original pieces of music. And I say that in quotations because what it really does is kind of pull together all these other past ones and put together what it considers like uh, a new creation within that. So it's not exactly the same. It sometimes can sound a little generic because it's pulling from all things that already exist. And so it can create these uh, pieces of music that have lyrics, they have someone singing it, they have background music, they have different instruments. It's pretty varied on what you can do with the audio one. But audio ones can also create clones of voices from snippets that people upload. So this is really interesting because there have been people who use this to create clone voices of celebrities. There are people who have tried to use this to clone a voice of someone that they've lost so that they can hear that person talk again. And it's really, I think, early on, but those have been some of the pushes that we've seen. And so these MuseNet and Suno are ones that I think are the most common audio ones, especially with creation of music. And I'll show an example of what Suno can create a little bit later. And then let's just move on to video. So this is one that is, I would say, the newest out of all of these. It's still very kind of rough around the edges. There's ones that are very easy to notice. There are ones that are a little bit harder. But this is something that just generates footage. You know, it just generates something based on your prompt. It also can have the ability to edit certain ones, but I think that's very early on. And so this one are Polo or Synthesia. And so we'll see an example of Synthesia's ones later. They tend to be a little bit shorter, but it's an interesting aspect. And then we have photos, which is another one that I think a lot of people are familiar with. They've seen it in one way or another. You know, this creates or changes images. It's also being implemented into our phones pretty quickly with things like iPhone is about to get something called Genmoji, which is you add a prompt, you talk about what you want in it, and it'll create an emoji of literally whatever you want. And so like I've seen people who put, you know, a cowboy hat on a cat and that's their prompt. And then it creates like cowboy boots on a little cat that you can just send to friends and everything. There's also, I think Google and maybe Samsung have been doing it where they've been making it so you can take out background like people or things in photos. And that's something that these AIs can be pretty good at. And so I think while these might not have like a direct impact in counseling always, I want to show a few examples of what each of these look like so we can get an idea of, oh, hey, this is something that was made with AI. Like I can kind of tell this a little bit better, or at least you can see some of the things that can hold these back because there are big mistakes that show up. I'm going to hold off on showing the text-based examples until we're more talking about counselor and counselor education because they're going to be really tied into some of the conversations we'll be having there. So let's go ahead and start with photos because like I said, this one is DALL-E and Midjourney are one of the most commonly used AIs, with DALL-E being a part of like ChatGPT and OpenAI. And so let's look at this first photo. And well, so we'll jump to photos in a second. Right now, I'm going to dive in just a little bit when it comes to what is a large language model. Because today, really, what I'm focusing on are LLMs and just touching on some of those other aspects. But broadly, this is what we would call generative AI. So it's creating something instead of just saying, here's all this information, I'm going to look at it. What it really wants to do is kind of generate and then predict human language. And that'll be something I come back to because that's a really important aspect of what these actually do. And so while we're talking about generative AI, there are several different forms of AI that I think are worth touching on. Machine learning is a subset of AI that we run into very commonly. It usually looks like Netflix recommendations that you get, spam filters on your email that tell you if something's spam or puts it into a separate one. Where deep learning is actually a subset within machine learning, where it is better at like image recognition, natural language learning. So being able to look at language and understand it and respond to it. So those would be what I would call like the older versions of like Siri, Alexa, Google, those kind of fall within that. Then we have things like imitation learning, which are AIs that look at something that a human's doing, and they try and replicate that. So these are usually done with bots. Maybe they can be done for like surgery or organization in Amazon warehouses. I know they've been using some bots for those. And then also for self-driving cars. So those really just try and look at a video or watching someone do something and try and replicate that. So those are different kind of aspects in AI, where LLMs are all about predicting the next word and making it coherent. And that feels like a really big simplification of what an LLM is. But when you talk about how it functions, it's not like reading everything and saying, okay, I'm going to build this response that's perfect and I understand this information. There really isn't any quote unquote understanding in it. It's a looking at, thousands, hundreds of thousands of texts, whether those be articles or web pages or videos. And it's looking at that and saying, okay, these have said, this string of words. We're going to keep adding to that. And so it's really good often at producing things where there's templates of it online a lot. So I'll show you guys a little later, but a treatment plan is something that these models tend to be pretty good at because those tend to be standardized. So it's very good at kind of predicting, oh, hey, this is the most commonly kind of used next few words, and it can build something that looks like it was well thought out and created, but really it's just this amalgamation of all these different things put together. All of these different documents and put together in a unique new way. And so there's a few different just aspects of this that I think are important when we talk about LLMs, because it can be really, really good at translating language. And so that means that it, sees what's being said, it can translate it into a more understandable thing for the reader. And so we'll probably see quite a lot of translating software come out in the next few years. And I think there's already been kind of a boom of mobile translating software where it's just on device using these LLMs. It's being integrated incredibly heavily into chatbots. And a big aspect of that is because these models, compared to conventional AI like Siri, feel more conversational. They feel more natural when you're talking to them. And so when you add this to a chatbot, whether it be a support, customer service, virtual assistant, or those celebrity bots I was talking about earlier, it's going to feel more conversational where you can still get any answers you want, but you don't feel like you're doing a multiple choice quest test where you don't know what those answers are. How sometimes you have to if you're on customer service, you're just give me a human representative, because you're hitting that brick wall of it not being able to communicate very well. And so when you go ahead and you say, hey, we are going to add this LLM to it, it's going to be more clear. It's going to feel like maybe you're talking a little bit more to a human, while being able to say something when it hits that brick wall of I don't know, even if sometimes that ends up being false. Another aspect of these LLMs is it's being used incredibly heavily with content creation, whether this be creating short stories, creating sometimes it's used as research as long as it's properly cited. People will help it write a paragraph, maybe they'll help it write the abstract. There's a lot of different things that it can be used for when we're talking about these creation and content creation. Sometimes it can be used to make a script for a video or a social media post. It's really good at making those kind of things. And so kind of ending on this aspect I really want to talk about, because I think it's important, and we'll give some examples of this later, is prompt engineering. So this is kind of a new term, but it's an important part of interacting with these LLMs. While I won't go over a bunch of in-depth recommendations when you're creating a prompt, and basically this is just when we go to Google, we ask it a question or we type in what we want to know. For AIs, when you prompt engineer, you're doing that, except you're wanting to be more specific. You have more flexibility in your question. And so you want to make it something where you can get the most out of this. Because the difference between a good prompt and a bad prompt are, one can get you like a really simplistic answer or something kind of small, where if you have a more developed prompt, and I'll show what that looks like, where you're specifying these things and you're telling it what you need specifically, it can be much more in depth. It can give you more information. It can allow you to get much more out of it than you would otherwise. And so just back to that prompt engineering, one of the important things that I think when we're talking about the recommendations here is that there's several aspects of what we're typing out that we want to take into consideration. The first of that is instruction. What do you want it to do? You want to be clear. Do you want it to produce a template? Do you want it to produce a story, a paragraph? What do you want that to look like? So for example, this might be create a treatment plan for a client with anxiety. So that's pretty simple. It tells you a bit of it, but you could add more to that. So then you build context onto that. You build upon that previous one. And so for example, this one will be create a treatment plan for a client with anxiety that's related to social situations and using an uploaded treatment plan as a guide. So there you're adding the context that the anxiety is about social situations. And then you're expanding on that and saying, hey, I'm going to upload my treatment plan template as a guide so it can just fill it out. And that's another thing these LLMs are really good at. They're good at filling out paperwork or filling out forms or making forms too. And so, you give it that context. And then you also want to indicate what kind of output do you want? What do you want out of this? Do you want paragraphs? Do you want bullets? Do you want it to make a PowerPoint, or do you want it to make a photo? So putting those three together and being as specific as possible is going to be really important when we talk about prompt engineering. But I also think it's important that you ask questions. You say, why did you make this decision? Or like, can you change this? And you can go from something that's really vague and really nebulous to something really specific by just asking and telling it to change or add things. And so that's really different than some of the other things that we've interacted with those older AIs, because they really couldn't do anything past your first question. And these can do just a lot more. So now that I talked a little bit about just what LLMs are, I'm going to jump into some of these photos and other versions of AIs that are being used right now and just show examples of those. So I'm going to start off with this AI created photo. And so this is one that I created using Dolly. And the prompt was something that I also used AI with. I actually used Claude to make the prompt for this. The prompt was a dramatic panoramic photo of Nebraska's sand hills at sunset, with rolling sand dunes covered in prairie grass stretching to the horizon. A lone windmill stands in the foreground while a massive storm cloud approaches, illuminated by golden sunlight. Sandhill cranes fly overhead in a V formation. The scene includes subtle details of prairie wildflowers, eucalyptus plants, and natural grasses in rich detail, photorealistic style. So with that prompt, I think that's very obvious that it was AI created because it's so wordy. And that's something you might see with these AIs. But what it ended up pulling looks okay. Like, this looks pleasant to look at. But I want to point out some of the things that are wrong, because I think that's something that we're going to see a lot. And when we're using this, it's something that you want to take in consideration. So just looking at this photo, I think a few of the things that stand out to me are these birds, for one, aren't in a V formation, but they're also just oddly shaped. They're just a like cylinder with wings. It's kind of funny looking there. This storm wall, cloud, whatever you want to call it, looks a little odd, like very fantastical almost in size. This flat kind of differentiation there, and then the rain just coming down. And I think we've seen photos like similar to that rain, but it's just a very, very dramatic. And then it gets a little confused, I think, when we talk about sand hills. And so it's this lush middle part where there's everything else is sand, which looks a little more desert-like than what I'd be referring to if I were talking about the sand hills in Nebraska. And then this windmill is just kind of odd. We have these points that are a little ragged. We have little mistakes right here, impossibilities where this is either facing out or towards us. And so these are things, along with these kind of weird lines here. Those are things to look out for when you're using AI that really kind of show the unrealistic nature of them or the struggles that it has with certain things. And a lot of these, when there's these odd behaviors or odd answers we get from these AIs, they're from something called hallucinations, which I'll dive into towards the end of our session today. But it's an interesting aspect to keep into consideration. So this is just a nice little background. Let's look at something with people, because I think that goes a good way to show how useful these can be. So this, I think, is probably one of the worst examples I've gotten out of AI, but it sometimes really struggles when we talk about people. So this prompt was create a photo of people posing. They appear to be fans of the Nebraska Huskers. And so this just ends up being creepy. Their pupils are all over the place. Their eyes just are messed up. They're unpleasant to look at. If you look closely at like hands, you'll see that this hand is just kind of a weird size for where it's at. And then this is actually supposed to be the other hand, and it's very tiny. And so when we're looking at these photos, it's something to think about, that they are going to have sometimes missing fingers. I think this one's kind of, these both have missing parts of their fingers or extra fingers. That's a big one that comes up, sometimes extra legs. But also, I think looking at teeth here is going to be one of those other things that we look at. Like, look closely. These are just kind of not right. You know, there's more gums. They're kind of odd. And then you have people with just a ton of teeth for some reason. And those are the little things that I think stand out when we make these photos that we're like, oh, that's, you know, that's creepy. Not to mention that anytime that there's writing and you're just using one of the more simple kind of free AIs, you're going to see that it just can't do it correctly. So sometimes it can do symbols pretty well, like it gets the Nebraska and very well. But the second you have complex writing or you have something that's a few letters long, it really has trouble with it in certain cases. And so I talk about, or I bring these up because I think there is some usability when it comes to how we might use these images. Maybe we use it for like flair or extra stuff on our website. And that's something that we want to be careful of, because if we have a bunch of creepy AI created images, it might turn people off from wanting to go and explore. This also, and I think the landscapes are probably the most usable version of these. It can be useful on Canvas, because we can just throw it in there, not have to worry about finding a photo that we can get through like stock images or have to pay for, and we can throw one of these on our website. And if we did, like the previous photo, I think would fit much better, because while there's mistakes, this could be just a background photo on something, where this does not fall into that at all. And so I think this is one of those bad examples of, hey, this is not one we want to have anywhere. So let's kind of continue past photos and talk a little bit about audio, because these are the ones that I think are one of the most interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and start this song that I created in the background and tell you guys a little bit about it while it goes. So this song was created using Suno, and the prompt that I used for this was create a song in the style of mid-2010s indie-tronica and synth pop. That is about a road trip through the state of Nebraska. And so kind of a simple, I had a band in mind that I was trying to replicate, Owl City, and I had used some of the prompting previously, because this took several attempts to be more specific in what I was asking for. And so you do have a lot of control when you want to make these music ones. Like, you can control the lyrics. It does, as you can hear, have someone singing them, and you can change the voice. You can change the style of music, the length of it, and it also creates by itself a title and artwork for that title. And so I think what they called this song was Nebraska Bound, which is very fitting with some of the lyrics. And this one, it's one of those ones that I'm like, hey, is this useful to counselor or counselor ed? And while I don't think of a lot of use cases that make sense for this. I think it could be something where if you want, free waiting room music, maybe you can create that. Um, you can even use this as a form of like art therapy with clients and have them create music based on feelings, based on maybe journals, like something where they can artistically do this, where maybe they don't have musical talent inherent, but they enjoy music. And so this would be a way for them to just explore that in a way that you can both hear and you can both kind of give it a try. I think this really could be also used for, or that idea could be used for photos too, where the client creates photos. Well, let's go ahead and continue. So the next one is one of the most exciting ones, but I think also very new. So I'm going to go ahead and show this completely AI created video as an example, and then I'll talk a little bit about it.
Hello all, this is a creation using Synthesia. This would be a free example with others being able to create more complex and moving people. A good example would be the newest Coke commercial.
Awesome. Yeah. So this, I think, was a really, really simple version of these AI videos. Low movement, the voice wasn't very realistic. And so I don't think the usefulness is there just yet for that. But as I mentioned, the Coke, or I wrote that what it talked about. And when it talks about that Coke commercial, one of the newest Christmas Coke commercials was made completely with these AIs. And so I don't think there's a lot of speech in it, but a lot of it is these people moving around. And these can do pretty good when it comes to making people. It's more troublesome when it's moving around. This is kind of that mix of that audio voice cloning that we're talking about, and also this video creation. And so again, I don't know that there's a lot of usefulness when it comes to counseling or counselor ed right now, especially since these videos do tend, at least the free versions of these AIs, tend to be limited to about like 10 or 15 seconds. And they literally just sit in one place. They're just kind of like an avatar. But I think in the future, there could be applications where there is role plays or models that we make just, we have our computer there, we make it really quickly for this very specific situation that's unique to a client. And so while I think we're probably 5 to 10 years away from that kind of ease, I think there is that possibility that it could be used as a role play kind of extra aspect to say, hey, let's watch this and give it a try. Because sometimes when we look for those examples or we're dealing with a specific situation, finding a helpful video online can be really, really tough. And sometimes modeling it can be a little hard. So if we have this backup of, hey, let's make this video, and as long as it's realistic and connected to reality enough, I think that will be something that we see pop up in the future.
Hello.
So hopping out of just the nature of what AIs are, let's hop a little bit into what it means for counseling practice right now. And so this is really going to heavily focus on LLMs because those other ones I don't think are being pulled in as much just yet. So this I think is really exciting because this technology has basically exploded over this last few years. And so there's all these different aspects that can be used. And so all of the things that I have on screen right now are different examples of specific AI companies that are working on creating something for like that niche. And so starting off just with note taking, this is something that is going to probably become increasingly promoted, increasingly used when it comes to counselors and how they take notes. So right now, how they function is that you'll go to their website or you'll download the program, and the AI will record and listen to the entire session, creating kind of a full note from that information. And so this could create, an intake, a soap note, burp, DAP, a group, and then even like EMDR couples, along with follow-up notes. So they allow for changes in that note if you disagree with something or it misheard something. You can have it create just summaries of a session. Maybe you can have it dictate if that's something that you want to do. You just talk it out and it dictates for you. And it also, a few of these will create a CPT code for that session from the information kind of provided. And I want to touch on a few of the security features if you look at these note-taking apps that you want to take in consideration, because that's one of the biggest issues with AI, is that we don't know a lot of the security stuff and how careful to be. And so first thing you want to do is check if they're HIPAA compliant. That is going to make it so you can actually use it with clients. Those have been kind of the big push for medical systems. Good encryption, and so do you just want to make sure that it has end-to-end encryption? Normally, this will be like the first or second thing on the page. You're going to want to look for a mention that it deletes the audio recordings after they are used for the AI, so you're not having any of that information stored, on their server. Some of them will do it on your computer, which makes things a little bit easier and a little bit safer. But I think those are a complication to think about. You'll also want to make sure that you have consent from clients, like built into those systems, or at least built into your system. I'll talk about this when we talk about ethics, but you want to make sure that you inform clients that you're recording and that you're using AI and get their permission. Otherwise, we're essentially like breaking confidentiality there. And there's this weird gray space of, is this completely safe? And so having consent, if you're going to do it, is going to be important. Data ownership is something that you want to kind of consider, because if the data is trained, if the data that you input, so like the client recording, is used to train the AI, then that means in a way it's kind of putting it out there. It may not be necessarily accessible to like other people, but it's still sitting on a server somewhere out of our control. And so you'll want to see that you own the data that is on your devices, or it will be deleted immediately after it is used. I wanted to touch on the fact too that these work in several languages, which is something that I think can be really useful for therapy, especially bilingual therapists that work in multiple languages, because then you don't have to do as much of that transition when you're writing notes or when you're switching between clients who speak different languages. And then there are newer ones. I think Upheal is the one that is the kind of furthest along in what they're promoting. And so they include even more data, like driven things. So they will include analytics about, speech cadence. How fast are you talking? How fast is the client talking? What are those talking ratios? How much are you talking versus how much are they? What are those clients' sentiments tending to lean? Are they positive, negative? Do they talk more in the past or future tense? How many moments of silence and how long do they last? And then they can also point out things through their data analysis that are either consistent threads through session. Maybe there's something that keeps coming up, or maybe you just want a idea of your client therapist relationships. And Blueheal at least says that they can provide that using the AI based on like tone, based on the words that are coming, based on how they refer to you. Like all of those things kind of come together to help explain all of that data. And so when we talk about how these are being used or how they might be used in clinical practice, it's important to remember too the costs. Some of them are free, but most of the time that's very limited, like 5 sessions a month or something like that. But then they can go up to $645 a person. If you're doing something like a person or organization like 500 sessions a month, it can go really, really high. And so these are going to be a growing, I think, conversation in counseling, if they're okay to use, what it looks like to use them, how to use them effectively. But Blueprint, Medalic, and Upheal are all ones that could be used and that are HIPAA compliant, that hit kind of all of those security standards we spoke about. And then let's just kind of move on to some of these other ones. So this is another aspect that I think is going to be just jumping through the roof. 24-hour bots that can respond to people. And all of these that I've included on this are AI therapist bots. So they are explicitly made to provide this like short form therapy. There's a lot to this. I think it's worth reading one of the disclaimers from the website. And I think this will come up on every single one, but it's this idea that it says, please note that while our AI is designed to provide guidance and emotional support, it is not suitable for professional medical or mental health care. LLMs created as either AI therapists or support. Let me just jump back a little bit there. If you ever feel overwhelmed, distressed, or consider harming yourself or others, we strongly encourage you reach out to a licensed mental health professional or contact emergency services like 911. Your safety and well-being are our top priority, and it is important to seek real human support when needed. So this is on every single website, and a part of it is, I assume, to protect themselves, but I also think an aspect of it is that this is really viewed as supplemental help. Walking through small troubles, just the basic kind of, here are recommendations that we could give to most people that deal with like anxiety or that deal with like mild depression. They don't tend to be for those that are going through kind of those bigger concerns, or they have suicidal thoughts or ideations or plans. That is where these are not at all what they're supposed to be used for. But I think that's hard to see from the outside. You know, someone just looks this up on Google and they think that this is supposed to be, you know, as good as therapy. And there's a lot of issues when it comes to how useful that could be there. So I played around with these a little bit just to kind of see what they could and couldn't respond to. And so I ended up talking a little bit, and it asked questions that were useful of like, what's going on? What specific aspects bother you of these things going on? It can do well there. But then when I started talking about safety or I talked about suicide, it either kind of ignored me or it just got stuck saying, you know, talk to a professional. And so those are the limits to these. And so these are, I think, early on too. And they are most effective at getting those basics of techniques. So this could teach CBT relatively well. But there is just these robots don't have empathy at all. They are just predicting these next words. So that makes it really tough sometimes to form a connection and feel like you are being cared for, where that human aspect I don't think will ever be replicated in this form. And they also you have to sign up for an account, which can be just another step that gets in the way. Do you really want to give your information to these companies? Those kind of things. And we don't know what they're always doing with data. Sometimes they'll sell it, which is really concerning if we're talking about mental health. Sometimes they keep it, or sometimes they delete it, which I think is really the good version of it. And something that I noticed with some of these bots that I've played with is that they tend to just go along with whatever you say. So there were times that I just paused and I said, tell me a joke or tell me something interesting. And it completely got offset of what we were doing and started telling me jokes or asking me what I found interesting. So like there are limitations to how usable these are, and they get very distracted because they want to answer what you put out there. I tried to pull these from the most accessible site, this AbbieGG, freeaitherapist.com. These are the ones that come up most easily. And I want to say AbbieGG is free, but there are ones where you have to start paying for credits in some of these other AIs, especially if you're talking to them for long periods of time. And so there's another one, I talked about it briefly before, but character AI is one where people make a lot of characters. And so they'll make celebrities or things from books. And there are people who have made AI therapists on these websites with no oversight and just kind of a vague idea of a prompt to put in. And so if you have a client talking to you about like maybe talking to those, you may veer away from character AI just because that's really more of a fun tool than it is anything useful. And I think that credit limited thing is something that you want to take into consideration too, because that's going to cut off who can use it. So let's kind of move on to treatment planning. So these they have some of the similar ones, you know, Blueprint, Nudge AI is one, Practice Better is another one. And these have a lot of crossover with the AI note taking. but they do a great job of creating goals and objectives once you kind of put in presenting problems and intake information. And I'll show an example of what one of these looks like a little later. And so another thing that I think we want to consider as professionals is we don't always have time to read these full articles of research or these like chapters in books to get a great idea. So sometimes we just need it quickly and we need to take a quick look at it. So when we look at GitLiner or Studico or Claude, what we can do is upload an article and say, hey, I want to hear the key points, maybe critiques from what I put in there. And it does a good job of that. It also could be useful if you say, hey, I'm looking at these techniques. I want to get an understanding of how the real world example of this could go. And then you put it in and it can do a pretty okay job of creating that. Maybe you want to look at data from research and just get it really simplified. You can also have that, getting bullet points for an article with relevant information. That's really helpful. And this is probably one of the more common uses of AI. But it's important that you double check. And I think they'll say that for a lot of it because they will hallucinate and get things incorrect. And so moving on to career counseling, this is one that I think is going to be that overlay of different professions coming together because there are several ones that help get your career started and going. And I think counseling is going to end up pulling this in too to make things easier. So I have a few examples here: Kick Resume, Careers Pro, Skilled Score. These tend right now to be more oriented around this idea of, hey, let's help you create a resume. Let's do a skill inventory and walk you through some possibilities. And I think this could be really helpful while being a little niche when it comes to career counseling, because it can help provide some of that extra guidance. It's very accessible, and it can pull together information a lot easier than we might otherwise and help with other aspects of career looking. Well, you can just talk about, what are these interests? Where do we want to go? What's stopping us? And the most useful thing I think with these is that some of them can help provide a educational layout. What do you need to do in education to get to this part? And I think that is incredibly helpful. All right. And then predictive models. So this is more falling into machine learning, but I think it's important because this is often how technology is used. There's research, and I have the citation here provided, that they're using AI to look into student data to predict how likely they are to suffer from anxiety or depression. And so this article speaks to the fact that AI can find predictive factors within a population like financial situations, maybe sense of belonging, disability status, and age, and say, hey, these specific sets of students are more likely to show anxiety or show depression. And I think this is very much something that we're hesitant about, and we're looking at it and we're saying, okay, we have to be careful with this, especially with the fact that since this is all looking at human created data, it'll also suffer from human prejudice, and it'll stereotype if not kind of interacted with and talked through properly, because it's following this kind of human-led data where it happens unconsciously or it happened consciously. And so whenever we add these to a part of a system, we want to make sure that they're not adding to this discrimination or this oppression based on these factors that it's trying to see from everything else going. And so I'm going to go ahead and show a few examples of what this could look like, especially with note-taking and with treatment planning. So let's go ahead and pull this up over here. So here is an example using Claude of creating a SOAP note. So I just asked, can you create a SOAP note for counseling and provide an example? And so it just does it. It pulls together this template where, it talks about presenting concerns. It provides all of these things that we might fill out when we're doing this. And it's pretty detailed. And it even includes, safety plan follow-up. And then it creates this example, which I think is pretty solid. I've been feeling overwhelmed at work and trouble sleeping. It talks about history, and this would be something where it hears your recording and puts this all together, and then it fills the note out for you, even to the point of, put your license number in, and then you just sign here. So this, I think, can also be explored in this paragraph form where this is more naturally what we might be using. So this just lays it out instead of, it still has these bullets, but then when we get down to this example, it has the paragraphs. And this is what we're likely to see when we use those websites that create these and use them. And so it goes into good detail. It tends to be very clinical, which I think can be a little troublesome sometimes. But it does a good job of laying it out how you would want it so that you could read it easily. And so that would be a type of SOAP note, but I think treatment plans are one of the more interesting ones. So this one I create a counseling treatment for a 20-year-old male client who presents with anxiety and stress related to finishing finals at college. Very common kind of thing that comes up. So it goes ahead and puts it in. It even has its diagnostic impression, which I would say mixed in terms of how good it is. But for this example, perfect. Adjustment disorder with anxiety. It's related to something happening right now. And then it creates goals, objectives for each of these. And I think this does a decent job. And the reason it does such a good job is that it's probably pulling from thousands of online examples of these, or pulling from textbooks where they do provide examples. So this does great, interventions, treatment schedule, measurable outcomes, crisis plans. It does everything you kind of need there. And I would say if you're using this, we're going to talk about the ethics, but you also just want to make sure that you're doing it and you're making sure you're reading it, because there are going to be flaws with these, and you don't want to put your name behind something that is flawed. Let's jump back in. All right. So that's a lot of the kind of the counseling aspect of it. I do want to touch on counselor education because I think this is really important too. And so there's two sides of this. Looking at counselor education, there's a lot of opportunities on both the student and the instructor side. And this is something because AI has been growing just massively over these last few years. And during that time, I have been a counselor, an instructor, and a student all at the same time. So I have all these different perspectives from what I've experienced in terms of what this looks like. And I'm going to include links at the end for walkthroughs on these, just to give a good idea of some of these other things that we can do when we're building it. So let's just start with instructor. There's a lot of flexibility that comes with using this into your Canvas or using this with your lesson plan. And so a few examples of AIs that are specifically created to help with instructors, Century, Gradescope, and Alta are ones that came up pretty quickly when I was looking through some resources. And although ChatGPT and Claude can provide similar services, and I'll show an example of that. But you want to make sure that you're kind of thinking about how much this is and that you're purposeful. And so some people have been considering these AIs as like an extra teaching assistant, where they can create full web pages, including the code, so you can make your Canvas cell more visibly appealing. You can use a textbook or previous syllabi or instructions and ask it to create like a structure for a class or a week-to-week template. You could also just say, hey, I have the specific subject, create an activity for it. And so these tend to be a little simple and need to be augmented for your specific kind of situations in class. But they work pretty well, I think. And I'll show an example of a class-created activity that Claude made. So like I made mine about a DSM class with ADHD, and I'll show you that. But other ones you could do is like you could say, hey, write a lesson plan about narrative therapy that includes an activity. And so when you can have it, and it'll go ahead and create it, and it does a pretty good job, but you're going to want to double check everything so that it's the correct information that you're wanting to teach. And also I think it can be harder if you're not an expert in those areas too, because you can't 100% check. So I wouldn't use these unless you had a really good understanding of the topic materials. And so another aspect of instruction, I think, is grade back and feed or grading and feedback. So this is something that I've heard quite a bit of people kind of dipping their toes in, but I think it's a really gray area. So you can, on these websites, upload a student paper or project, and you can either include a rubric or you can just include some instruction on how to grade and ask it to grade the entire assignment and provide feedback. There are several considerations you want to take before you do this. Don't include student information. You don't want to, I think, even include the original document because there might be identifying information in the metadata. And well, I will say, so this one's a little tough because I think there's agency on the instructor to grade these how they think, but sometimes it can be a backup to see if there's any maybe things coming up for the professor that are getting in the way, or making sure everything is even. But these are really good that if you say, hey, I just want to see maybe if they hit the word count, they hit APA formatting, they hit all of these standards, yes or no. So take away one of the more simple things in there. And then finally, I want to touch on AI detection because that's a huge, huge conversation when we talk about these LLMs in school, because we want to, the question of students using it is so, so huge. And Turnitin has a built-in feature that you can turn on in Canvas, but there's also things like ZeroGPT, Quillbot, and copy leaks. So this may be something that if you're concerned that students are using AI in papers, you might run it through one of those services. And I will say, test this out on your own stuff. Like, see if it pops up some false positives, because it can. I'll talk a little bit more about the issues in a second, but like, put your own stuff through it so you can see how often it says, hey, this part was created by AI, even if it's your direct work. Maybe create some AI work too and upload it just to see if it can tell. And so the huge caveat I'll put with usage of these is that they are not always accurate. If a student has a very straightforward writing style, it may create a false positive. Even OpenAI's website talks about the issues with these programs not being able to 100% tell where the plagiarism program in Turnitin, I think, is a lot more trustable. The AI one is not as like 100% provable, which creates issues if you are giving consequences to a student. And another thing with, this may be a little bit older, but Turnitin, at least originally, their AI was only in response to like ChatGPT 3, which is their free model. And that can create issues itself because the newer models won't be able to be told, or won't be able to be like the finger pointed at them. They won't know as well because they have so many more features and they've been built on. And so that can cause kind of an unfairness for those students if you're putting them through this, but you're missing students who are using AI to create these. And so I think that discussion really needs to be had at both like a program level and a student level so that they can understand what they can and can't use it on, instead of it just being kind of unclear. And so when I've had my classes, something that I think is important to put in is having a conversation early on, probably first day, of, hey, you know, AI is becoming this thing. Here is what you can use it for, and here is what you can't use it for. And that conversation, I think, is helpful early on, so there's not unsurety and students don't get into trouble for using it when they didn't know or they thought it was okay. And so I also think it's important not only to talk about it in class, but it's also important to have it on your syllabi. Maybe you just have a description of what level of AI is allowed. Maybe you have no usage is permitted. Maybe some is permitted when given permission, like you want to want them to use it on a specific project. Or sometimes you just give them open reins and they're encouraged, but they have to do proper citations. And that's a really important one. So I've used this in the class that I teach at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, because they had asked instructors to build in ChatGPT into one of their classes and see how it works. And so what I did is I built a system where each week the students would do a role play or a few role plays, and we asked them to create the persona or the role play scenario using ChatGPT. And I think it did a pretty good job on that, on giving them an idea of, hey, here's how I want to do it. And I think there were some issues too, because I would have them do small projects in small groups, and you could tell which ones used the AI to help because I told them they could. And those tended to be just like way overdone. Like it produced just way too much information that wasn't appropriate for the time given. And so let's go ahead and jump to the student side. As I said with how I implemented it in my class, I think for within counseling, role plays and vignettes are going to be incredibly useful. It can create them quickly, it can create them varied, it can take into cultural considerations into account. I think it does a really good job of creating those quickly. As a student, I think it's important to give like an idea of what there are. There's a big question of if these are used on homework or tests. And I just want to mention that, yeah, like students can just enter in your quiz questions or prompts and get an answer out of it. It can be good, but it often gets things incorrect, especially if it doesn't have any background information in those AIs. So debatable, but they can do a pretty good job, especially if your quizzes are on test bank. That's probably the thing that stands out the most with how easily it can pull information. But not only can it produce just those those multiple choice answers, it can also produce, a paragraph or an entire paper if asked. And I think this is probably the time that it would be the most noticeable because it doesn't always sound like their writing voice. There are times that it just decides to go in a completely different direction than what the assignment's asking. Or it just is way more technical than developmentally the student is at. And so you're going to want to take a look for those kind of things. Some examples that we've seen before are there are times where maybe a student is asked to write a paper. I know a really common assignment is like a DSM paper, talk about a character with a diagnosis, a possible diagnosis. And you'll see things where it just goes in a weird direction. So maybe it talks about the like literary usage of literary devices in the movie or the show or the book. Maybe it talks about the filmmaking. Like it'll get distracted on different aspects. And so watching out for that, those other things is going to be important because students can and will use these occasionally. But then I think that opens up a bigger question about, does this mean that we change from like quizzes or we change from having them write it out of class and having them write it in class where we can watch them? And it's a hard question to answer, and it kind of depends on what the class looks like. And I think one of the big things is that when we look at how we want this to be shown, like their education to be shown with us, we want to be intentional on those assignments that we pick. And now we have to be aware that there are certain things that they can kind of skip through using these AIs. I don't think these are foolproof by any means, like these AIs or the things that we can do, but there are things that we can add to our classes that make it go a little smoother, like giving them a Google Doc to write in so you can track all the changes. And then I think this last one's probably the most simple. It is just getting some grammar and organization in writing. Hey, can you tell me what the grammar looks like in this paper? Or, hey, can you help me organize this? And so students will do that. And you just have to be careful because it can go as simple as telling you misspellings to rewriting entire sections of the paper. So let's look at an example of this real quick. So this will be a master's level role play scenario, and I'm just going to scroll through this super quick, but it created, with just a prompt of creating this for a class, a full 3 different scenarios for the students to jump into: cultural backgrounds, relevant information, referral information. It produces some 3 pretty good examples that they can jump into, including like, what is the focus? So this one's a life transition. What is expected from the counselor and the client and the observer? And then how do you evaluate? So it'll include all of this on just a real quick, 30-second question. And then tell, maybe they want to write a assessment form. maybe we want to modify it with specific things. And so that I think does a pretty good job, especially with role play scenarios. But also when it comes to, hey, let's create a lesson plan. So I just told it to create a master's level DSM class that focuses on ADHD, and it created a 3-hour length class with learning objectives, what they need to read beforehand, like sections of what it wants to look like, the activity that they participate in, and like things that they need to fill out, and then you can hand it. And this goes on for something like 5 pages. And I think this is probably the most useful because I want like prompt questions or discussion questions. It includes questions that you can ask to the student. And so I think there's something to be said about making your own of all of these, but this is, I know, is being used from professors who are in a crunch or professors who are trying to change things up a little bit. So I'm just going to jump right into ethical considerations because I think this is an important aspect of this for both counselors and counselor educators, because HIPAA and FERPA are considerations that we want to consider because we're still figuring out what these mean. And we need to be aware of being what is uploaded. So for therapist-centered sites, you want to make sure it's HIPAA compliant. You want to make sure that it follows all of these secure standards. And the bigger issue is if you put these into ChatGPT or Gemini, because those use that data for training, where the HIPAA and FERPA ones will not. And so that's a lot safer. It protects you, it protects your client. And so these other ones I want to touch on are just kind of concerns in the broader sense. So originality, this more I think matters for research or for academics, because who is the creator of the things? Is it you, the LLM, the person who put in the training data? And we don't have an answer to that really. And so when we come to plagiarism in schools, that's an issue with AI. When we come to templates that we create, that might be an issue, especially if we, sell those or we try and use those practice-wide. There's just those questions that come up. And then the last thing I just want to touch on are hallucinations, because this is probably the most concerning thing when we talk about LLMs, because they are just very advanced text predictors, and they can put in incorrect information. That's false, misleading. As early as last year, these LLMs would create false references that just never existed. And these have gotten better over time, but I think with all of these, we want to be intentional. We want to double check them to make sure the information is correct. And we want to make sure nothing is put in AIs that can be traced back to a person, because that breaks kind of everything we're doing it for. And I'm just going to add this last thing and talk about the energy consumption as a part of this environmental concern. These do take kind of wildly different amounts of energy, one prompt to another. But a standard question that you just put in takes about 10 times the power that a Google search does. And in a large prompt, like if you wanted to get a whole paper or a PowerPoint presentation in, one of those could take as much power as a light being on for 3 hours. So like on the individual scale, these can kind of be okay, but then we have a question as these get used more and more of if it is okay to use these with the environmental impact. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. And I want to end things today with these are mostly oriented towards professors, but I think they're important for each aspect, especially if we're going to build them into counseling too. Just some guides and resources that are really helpful. And so I know I covered a lot today. I appreciate everyone who's able to watch, and feel free to contact me with any questions. If you're looking for more resources at this email below, I am very much interested and a little critical of all this AI stuff. So I've been trying to get as knowledgeable as I can. And I just wanted to say that I appreciate all of you for being able to make it. And I look forward to continuing to kind of build what this AI looks like together.